Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adobe Live. My name is Anna McNaught, and I'll be your host today. And I am joined today by Daniel Livingstone for day 2 of some Photoshop and Lightroom and photo editing. It's very exciting stuff that we have going on. So welcome, Daniel. How are you doing today?
Hello, Anna. Thank you guys for having me again. I'm doing great, feeling a lot of good energy after yesterday's stream.
Yeah, yesterday's stream was amazing, and your retouching is just absolutely incredible. I mean, your work is incredible. If you haven't checked out Daniel's work yet, be sure to do so. I think you have such a great eye for the way you compose your shots and, of course, the way you edit them too. And I know I learned a lot yesterday. I hope that everyone else did as well. And we have some exciting things planned for day 2. So welcome everyone into the chat. Hey, Sam, how's it going? Just a reminder to you all out there on Behance and YouTube, be sure to start your day with our curated section of the Photoshop Daily Creative Challenge each day this week at 9 a.m. Pacific. It's a great chance for you to challenge yourself with some new Photoshop prompts every day and brush up on those skills. So for those of you joining over on YouTube, welcome. For those of you on Behance, hello. Be sure to pop into the chat today and say hi to Daniel and myself, and feel free to ask any questions that you may have along the way. So Daniel, I know you have a very exciting video for us that you showed yesterday, but for anyone just joining today, I would love for them to see that.
Oh, I would too. Let's get it going.
Perfect.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Livingstone,
And today,
we're streaming on Adobe Live.
all right, let's make this quick. I'm from Chicago, Illinois. I shoot photos and videos. I also do a lot of editing. And sometimes I stream it all.
I think that covers it. Now let's get back to the stream.
Oh, so awesome. I love what you did with that.
Thanks. I mean, it was such a blast to make. Like I said yesterday, when Adobe asked me to kind of present myself, I was trying to figure out the most creative way I could do it. You know, I figured it's a creative platform for creatives by creatives. I wanted to give my all to displaying something as simple as a bio in just a really fun way.
Yeah, so cool. Like very, very innovative way to show off your work. So good job. So do you want to give a little recap maybe about what we did yesterday, just super briefly, for anyone who wasn't with us? You can always watch the replay at any time. I believe the link is below, so be sure to check that out if you missed it. But yeah, over to you, Daniel.
Yeah, so a quick little recap of what we were working on yesterday was we started with this image, and the backstory is that we had a commercial fitness photo shoot, or a mock commercial fitness photo shoot, because this wasn't necessarily for a client, but we shot it as if it were. And that's kind of the way that I like to do my test shoots, is giving myself a prompt, creating some sort of constraint or limitation to kind of say, like, what can I make within this box? And how can I think outside of that box to push myself even further? So we were going for more of like a Nike editorial fitness ad. And we were shooting with my friend here, who is a personal trainer and a bodybuilder here in Chicago. And we shot at a very like urban, gritty location. So we started in a parking garage and just kind of made our way about the downtown area shooting. So we started with this image, which was one of the first shots we got as kind of a warm up. And I explained that I was going for a very like warm sunset vibe, and I wanted to edit it in a way that kind of gives the audience that feel while still keeping the focus on the subject. So we shot this, did a little bit of color grading in Lightroom, and then we took it over into Photoshop to do some cleanup, and we got rid of all those blemishes in the wall and just really made it neat, organized, and simplified.
Yeah, it looks so good, so clean.
Then we took those same settings and very quickly batch edited them onto a couple other poses that we liked, making this as efficient as possible and giving us the most amount of looks that fit this feel. From there, we kind of moved on to these other shots of our subject standing on a platform with the cityscape in the background. So not so much a flat backdrop, but something with a lot more depth, a lot more versatility. And we use some local masks to actually help shape the lighting to give it that complete look. And I'm going to do another before and after here. So this is what we started out with in the raw, and did some color toning, added some radial masks and some linear masks and some subject selections to really make our subject pop.
Yeah, looks so, so good.
In addition to that, we tried a couple other looks where we took the same kinds of shots and scenes, and we actually did a cool tone look using the exact same tools inside of Lightroom. So just getting two very, very different styles all within the same suite.
Yeah, that before and after was so incredible, and just seeing the different styles and the way you edit is very interesting as well.
And this was all done entirely in Lightroom. There was no Photoshop involved, no complex masking, no pixel retouching, just straight up Lightroom tools.
Love it. So great. Yeah. And so what do you have planned for us today?
So today we're going to continue editing a couple more images, and I actually have some images that I didn't show yesterday from our same location that have lighting involved. So we did some really dramatic portraits in those same. You'll recognize this wall from yesterday's stream, but we have a very different feel, incorporating some strobes into our work. And then in addition, I think today's stream is going to be a little more focused on the Photoshop side. We did a lot in Lightroom yesterday, so I want to spend a little more time in Photoshop breaking down some advanced retouching techniques.
Nice.
So starting out with this image, I really like the expression of the talent. It's very intense. It's very like intimate. She's got, a very serious look, straight at the ground, hands on the knees. She looks like she's really tired after a good run. So I'm going to keep it as dark as I can. And I'm going to use the select subject tool right off the bat because I like the way that she is lit. I want to make the overall image darker without losing any information on her. So I'm going to do a select subject mask, and then I'm going to invert that mask. So it's actually the background instead of the subject. And I'll rename our mask here to background so it's organized. And then I will bring down the exposure to really keep this moody, but still retain all the information we have with her. And I'll lower the shadows as well and the blacks, just to make sure that this is really dark, but doesn't look like cut out and fake. So I may also need to do a mask on her just to make sure that she's not too separated with the exposure. And after yesterday's stream, I actually discovered a new tool. We were talking about duplicating masks, inverting them. It seems like in Lightroom's most recent update, they actually added a button for that called duplicate and invert masks. So
cool.
They're very keen on this process, and they've added tools for us to do it a lot quicker. So now we have background inverted, which is once again our subject.
Is there a way, once, I guess maybe it would be through adding with a brush, but once you've selected the subject, like say in this example, you just want to kind of blend the edges of it. So it's not like she's not cut out as perfectly, and it's almost as if it's a radial filter, but it's kind of still focused on the subject and just blended. Is that possible?
So there are some tools in here where I believe, with the brush tool at least, so you see these add and subtract tools, we can use other masking tools in Lightroom to add on or modify. So we can add a brush, and then we can kind of brush around the edges of our mask to make it a little softer. So we can do a little bit of manual blending here if I didn't want that edge to be so hard. And then here in the sliders of our brush tool, we can adjust the feather and the density of that brush to kind of change how our brush is interacting with the mask.
Nice. Yeah, that's super helpful.
So I have my subject here masked out along with the background. And in addition, I kind of want our subject mask to darken from the bottom side. So we can actually do that using a subtract tool, and we can subtract using a linear gradient. Now I love that they've added these interactive masks because these are techniques that I used to use in Photoshop all of the time. And I thought it was like my own special like technique that I never saw anyone else doing. And then Lightroom came out with these and I was like, okay, so other people are onto this, but it is a great workflow. So we have our subject here and I'll keep the overlay on just so we can see what we're working with. And in our new linear gradient that we're subtracting, I can drag this from the top to the bottom. And now you will see that it is affecting more so the bottom side than the top side of our subject. So we can pull this down and you'll see that it's mostly hitting this and not so much this. And with that, I will use that to further shape the light like we were talking about in yesterday's stream. And I'll bring the exposure down to that so that the bottom half of her body is darker than the top half. And it just makes it look a lot more spotlighty on her face.
Wow, that's cool. I didn't even know you could do that.
So now we've shifted attention towards the face, away from the bottom of the body and away from the background. We want to keep our eyes kind of in this area. And you'll notice that this has now become brighter than anything else in the frame. In addition, I think we can add some color grading to it. So if it's a more intimate kind of moody shot, I think bluer tones are going to be better for this. So I'm going to cool off the color temperature of this shot entirely. And I'm going to add a vignette on it too, just to push that darkness a little further. And actually, instead of the vignette tool being a perfect circle around the edge, I'm going to go back to my masks. I'm just going to do this as a manual radial mask because I don't want it to hit this top edge. So I'll pull it everywhere except for that. And we're just going to really keep bringing that attention towards her face and the top edge of the frame. I'm also going to use our color grading tool, which we relied on heavily yesterday. And I'm going to pump some more blues into the shadow. And a little bit of yellow in the highlights. The reason I say yellow is because it is the opposite color on the wheel from blue, which means they are complements. And that's just going to help us get a little more contrast in there. So it'll separate all these brighter parts from the darker parts a little bit further.
Is there kind of a color palette that you like to use most often, like blues and yellows? Or
I find as a photographer, a lot of us fall into the orange and cyan trap. It is such a popular color palette and it seems very like cliche, but there is a reason behind it. And there's a reason why it's so popular. And that's just because it goes back to the film stock days in old Hollywood where they first started using color film regularly. And there was a film stock that I don't remember the exact name of, but what it would do is it would produce results that added a lot of skin tone accurate color in the highlights. So it would make skin look really natural and realistic. And then the only natural complement to that they would use was blue to create separation from skin to everything in the scene. So it really makes your portrait or your human subjects stand out from everything else. So it would add a lot of yellow, pink, and red tones to the highlights. And then it would just do a lot of blue and cyan to the shadows. Because when you're working with human subjects, you're really limited on your color palettes because you have to get accurate skin tones. Right. And you're only allowed a certain kind of range of hues with that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I figured it was partially a trend, but that's cool to hear that there's actually a reason for why that became so popular and why people gravitate towards it.
Yeah. And I mean, I could display, like I could have a little bit of leeway in this hue range. It's probably somewhere from here to about here where I can adjust the hue and the skin tones would still look pretty natural. It's once I start getting into this green range that the subject starts looking a little sickly.
Yeah.
But you could totally go for like a Fight Club look where they add a lot of like unnatural colors to the skin tone and it gives it this really like surreal look. I mean, it's all a stylistic and creative choice. When it comes to commercial things, though, I think you'll find that your clients are looking for more natural looks or more realistic looking things. Something with a little attitude and edge, but definitely want to keep that within the realm of reality.
Yeah. So did you learn a lot of what you're teaching here today? And like, you just seem to really, really know what you're doing and even the history of it. Did you learn that from school or from your mentors?
A combination. When I first started out in my creative journey, I started on Photoshop CS5 or 6 back in the day where I just downloaded the program and I was just playing with a lot of stock assets or things that I found on Google Images, doing a lot of compositing and manipulation. And I really liked like compositing and just like manipulating photos. And back in the early days of like Facebook, I found myself like retouching my profile pictures and making sure my image quality was like the best it could possibly be for my own like personal social media.
That's awesome. Yeah, you really, really know your stuff.
And then from there, I've just kind of always tried to keep up with it as much as I could. So always staying on top of trends, always keeping up with updates that are coming out, or just doing research on what the industry is doing. I think
Cool.
staying up to date is really, really important as a creative, especially with the new generation, because things like TikTok can completely, upend an entire industry, and you don't want to be left behind on that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And do you have any places that you recommend for kind of keeping up with the trends or knowing what industry standards are?
I think talking to a lot of people in the industry is important, like staying up to date with your peers and your contacts and just seeing what everyone else is doing. In addition, I say like a lot of like creative publications. Like I personally keep up with like Petapixel or F-Stoppers or just DP Review, other online publications that are relevant to your industry, and seeing, what's going on with the latest cameras that are coming out, or Adobe updates. Like I find myself in Adobe forums all the time, especially when I'm trying to troubleshoot stuff. And even this morning I was helping someone with a Premiere issue they had, and it was an issue that I had literally 3 days ago that I was just diving through forums on.
Yeah. Yeah, the forums are super helpful.
So I think this is in a pretty comfortable place that we can begin like a retouching process on. So I'm going to open this inside of Photoshop.
Photoshop's taking its time today.
Yeah, as a fresh start, I figured I'd do a clean reset of all my computer stuff today for the stream.
Yeah, smart.
But we're here with our background layer, and I use Photoshop actions all the time. As a retoucher, these are like your best friend to make things really easily, especially because in the retouching process, when you go into Photoshop to do stuff, it's a very much on a picture by picture basis. So Photoshop isn't really for batch editing that much. But when you have multiple deliverables, like from our Lightroom catalog, how we were able to apply look to so many images, and we were talking about giving your client a lot of options to review. If they select multiples of those, they're all going to need to go through the same retouching process. So anything you can do to kind of automate and make your process faster is a benefit. For me, I have my own Photoshop actions that I've created just using some of my workflows and recording them. And that's how actions work. So if I wanted to create a new action, I would hit the record button, and then anything that I do, any operation that I do in Photoshop, it will save that operation and in order. And then once I stop recording, it will play all those things out on any new image that I open up. So the order part is very important. Actions can be really tricky to make, I've found, and editing them is even harder because you have to really be specific about the step-by-step process of what you're doing. And you can see here, this is my frequency separation action. This is another one that I've created. And you can see here, these are all of the steps that I did that I recorded just to build a frequency separation template for myself.
Wow.
And this isn't necessarily doing any of the retouching itself. This is just kind of prep to set up my layers so that I can retouch. So this is a frequency separation. This one's titled 8-bit. It's because we are working on an 8-bit image right now. And you can see down here, if you open up this panel, you get a couple of information options. So if we open up the profile, it'll show the color space, which is Adobe RGB 98, and then the bit rate or bit depth. So this is an 8-bit image. If you are working in a 16-bit and you want to work in an 8-bit or vice versa, you can always go up to image mode and you can change the bit depth of your image here.
And what is the benefit of working in 8 versus 16?
So the bit depth of your image kind of gives you a X amount of color channels that you're working with. So in an 8-bit color space or 8-bit depth, you get 255 channels of each color, red, green, and blue. In a 16-bit, it increases that number exponentially. So you will have way more colors to work with. And 16-bit versus 8-bit helps with things like banding. You'll see where if you do a gradient, you might see like straight lines of like where the colors are shifting to the next color. A bit depth of 16 will give you a lot more options in between, and it'll kind of fix that stair step look.
Yeah, that's an issue that I deal with often.
Yeah, I find that if you're working on color sensitive things or things that use a lot of gradients, 16-bit is usually the way to go. The trade-off, though, is that it literally doubles your file sizes because you have twice as many colors.
Okay.
So if you're trying to save space in your storage, you probably want to work in 8-bit. But if that's not really an issue for you, then 16-bit is perfectly fine.
That's usually why Photoshop yells at me and says, your file is too big. We can't save this.
Yeah, storage is always such a hassle for us professional creatives.
Absolutely.
So I've run the action here, and we have a folder that says frequency separation. And if I expand that, it has all of our layers in it. This has a low frequency layer, a tonal layer, a high frequency layer, and a texture clean one. I don't use this as much, and for the simplicity of the stream, I'm not going to use it in this demonstration. So we really have 3 layers here: low, high, and tonal in between. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with frequency separation, the name kind of gives it away. What it does is it separates the tone and the texture of your photo. So you'll notice here, like the color blue and the blurred out stuff in the background is more of a tone thing. All of the fine details and high points of contrast you see, like this hair texture, this skin texture, the eyelashes, the chain, those are all kind of like high frequency things. Those are the texture of the image. I mean, you can zoom in, you see like all this skin texture is texture. And if I show this layer by itself, it'll look kind of weird. It's kind of gray, and you don't really see a lot except for these like highlight layer lines and textures. This is the layer we're working on for these things. If I show the low frequency layer, you'll start to see more of the image, but it's blurred out. So this is all the tone. This is the texture, and we've separated those into 2 different layers so we can work on those things independently. And the tonal I'll get into in a little bit. So as a demonstration, I usually start with the tone layer because that's where I find a lot of the issues exist, but I'm going to start with texture because it's easier to explain. So we see a blemish here, and I'm going to use the patch tool, and I'm going to grab this blemish and sample from a cleaner part of skin. Now you'll notice that the texture of that has changed, but there's still the highlights underneath from the original blemish. You can see that there's still that shadow that it created. That's because that information is stored in the tone layer. So I'm going to select the tone layer. I'm going to grab that with the patch tool. I'm going to move that, and you'll notice that the skin texture is not changing. We still see all these tiny highlights, but the color underneath is changing with it. So I'm going to apply that, and now you'll see that the blemish is gone, but it looks a lot more natural because we keep those textures and we just change the tone underneath.
Yeah, for some reason, like no matter how many times I've tried to do this method, I still can't fully wrap my head around it. So this is helpful.
So for example, this blemish isn't necessarily a texture issue. It's not creating a lot of bumps that we can see. It's just kind of a dark line. So I'm going to assume that this is a tone issue. So I'm going to go to our tone layer. I'm going to use the patch tool once again, and I'm going to highlight that area. And I'm going to sample from a similar part nearby that looks about the same. And you'll notice that it's a lot less dense. The shadow starts to disappear, and it seems like there is some tone here. Yeah, if I look at the texture or the texture layer here, there is a little bit there. So even if I'm just looking at the texture layer, I'm going to grab that area, move it to something cleaner, and you'll see that it's gone entirely. So it actually was more of a texture issue than a tone issue. And part of frequency separation is it requires a lot of practice. These are all educated guesses, and it'll be hard if you're starting out to know what's what. So a safe bet is like these little highlight bumpy blemishes. That's texture. So I can move that texture away without changing the actual. I can sample from a darker area like this, and we still only keep the texture. So this area doesn't have a dark spot like it would if we weren't using frequency separation. So I can sample from anywhere on the face as long as the texture is what I want without worrying about the color of the tone of the area we're sampling from. So this is a really dark area that we're going to from a light area, but you notice that it doesn't really change that much. So I just kind of go in and find all of the biggest blemishes to work on first before I start paring down to the little stuff. And I think a healthy place to be working at is somewhere between 100 and 200%. Anything past that is kind of more difficult for people to notice, and you're usually spending too much time working on details that are invisible.
Right. I don't know if this is something that you fully want to get into, but someone in the chat is asking how you actually create the high frequency tone layer.
There are a lot of good tutorials on YouTube on this,
Okay.
but I can do a quick demo just to show you. So other people explain this better than me, and I kind of have this committed to memory as best as I can. And another thing to note is your frequency separation layers, the way you build them, differ depending on whether you're an 8-bit or 16-bit. So that's something important to keep track of. This is 8-bit, and this is the one I memorized the best. So you're going to duplicate your background layer twice. You're going to turn off the top one, and on the bottom one, you're going to apply a Gaussian blur. And you're going to set this level of blur radius to just enough where you don't see texture. So you're kind of looking, I'm going to look over here just for the skin texture. And the second this kind of fades out to where I can't really discern a lot of the texture is where it's going to go. So on this image, it's looking somewhere about anywhere between 5 to 8. So I think I'm just going to do 7, maybe even 8 or 9. So now we can't really see a lot of texture here. It's all blurred. Then we're going to turn on our top layer, and naming these will help too. I'm going to just call this low frequency tone. This will be high frequency texture. And with the high frequency, now that our tone is established, we're going to go to image, apply image. Our source is going to be the document that we're on, which is image 1176, which is this document. Our layer, we're going to select as the low frequency, this low frequency layer here. The channel is RGB, invert doesn't need to be checked. The blending mode is going to be set to subtract, and our opacity is 100, and scale and offset are going to be very specific. These need to be set to the values of 2 and 128. I could get really into the mathematical explanation of this. Basically, what this is doing is we blurred out our tone layer, and that's just taking all of the color channels or points of contrast that are really low. So like nothing that's super detailed. And then our high frequency is saying all of the blurred stuff, we're going to subtract that from this layer. So it's only high contrast things. And that's why it's called frequency separation. So it's the low frequency, which is kind of blurred stuff, and then high frequency, which is really textured stuff. And that's how we separate those things. So the high layer includes everything except what's included in tone. And then we want to set the blending mode of our high frequency layer to linear light. That way, when we group these layers and then we turn our new frequency separation off and on, nothing changes. And this is how you know that you've done it correctly. I'm turning this group off and on again, and you'll notice that there isn't anything changing with the image, because all we've done, we haven't manipulated the image. All we've done is separate its elements. And since they're stacked on top of each other, they line up to create the full range of frequency.
Awesome. Thank you for explaining that. That's very helpful.
And like I said, there are a lot of really great tutorials on YouTube about this. Pix and Perfects is a really good one. He explains it really well. F-Stoppers from back in the day is also a really good one. I mean, that one was made like 12 years ago now, but it still holds up so well. So with this, and this part of the process is kind of the longest one in my retouching workflow, is just skin retouching. I'll just do a lot of frequency separation stuff. I'll just be fixing tone and texture and just grabbing blemish areas. And this is where it gets really therapeutic. You'll find if you watch some of my own streams on Behance that if you tune in at a random time, this is most likely what you'll see me doing. You'll most likely see me doing is just working on skin this close and just talking about it.
It really is very meditative to do.
It is so therapeutic. And this is like one of the first, like I learned frequency separation pretty early on into my retouching journey. And this is what really got me into it, was just how like satisfying these adjustments were. And it might be tedious, but it's very simple and straightforward. So it has the potential to be really relaxing.
Absolutely. Sean said mixer brush on the color layer works so good. I'm not
Yes. And when I
Okay.
get into tone, I will go over that because that was something that I discovered within the past year that I've been using a lot.
Cool.
So we seem to have removed a lot of the texture blemishes that we were going for. I can now move on to tone. So you'll notice little like shadows in the indentations of the head, like these veins. If we wanted to smooth them out, that's not necessarily a tone issue. Or not a texture issue, it's a tone issue. So if I look here, you can still see those darker spots, and those are the things we're trying to fix. So you can verify that it's all existing within this layer. So one thing that I used to do, you can still use the patch tool and sample from other parts of the skin. The adjustments are going to be a lot more subtle, and you might have to do more passovers on it. Another tool that you can use if you were blending larger areas is using the mixer brush tool. And this is something that I learned from Pix and Perfect's channel, Unmesh, who I know is like a good friend of Adobe. They've done tons of stuff with him. Showed me in one of his tutorials that the mixer brush tool is a great tool to use on tone. So what you want to do, and these are also pretty specific settings, is use the mixer brush tool that can be found. I have a custom tool layout here. This will most likely be found under your regular brush tool. I've just separated it for my own keyboard shortcuts. But you want to do the mixer brush tool, and you want to have this button checked. And if I hover over it, it is clean the brush after each stroke. So if there's a color in this box that is not correct, you want it to be this transparent checkerboard. The wet percentage is at 1, the load is at 75, mix at 90, flow you can adjust, but I keep it around 15. I think this is smoothing, this will be at 10%, and the angle is at 0, and if you're using a circular brush, the angle won't matter. So what this does, and I can demonstrate this on a blank layer. If I have two colors, let's say a black and a white, like this, and I use the mixer brush, and I start at one point and brush, hold down, and move into another place, you'll see that we start to mix those values together.
Oh, snap.
So I can mix black and white together into a gray, and it goes in any direction you move your brush. You can grab from the blacks and move more of the black into the white. You can grab from the white and move more into the black, but it ultimately just does what the name is, and it mixes values together. If I keep doing this, it will mix into a perfect gray because that's just the middle point between those two values. You can also use this for skin tones, and it works the exact same way. So if I grab a darker skin tone value and a lighter skin tone value. So these are pretty traditional skin tone values. And I use the mixer brush between them. Let's say this is a highlight on some skin and this is a shadow on some skin. I can blend those two together to meet in the middle for a nice, more even tone. Still looks like skin tone, but it is a true value. And these are just artificial colors that I've placed. It works a lot better when you're working with real tones like this in a pixel image. So you see in the same example, this is a darker area, this is a lighter area. We can use the mixer brush tool and take those values and just kind of brush across them very subtly, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And you'll notice that shadow kind of fades into a gradient. And same with this line here with the shadow on the forehead. If I'm going to take from the lighter side and kind of push it into the darker side, you'll notice that shadow starts to fade a little bit. And the edge between them becomes a lot less severe. And while you're doing this, go on.
I'm like blown away. I can't believe I didn't even know about this tool. I'm so ashamed of myself. This is awesome.
So while you're doing this, it is very difficult to see what you're doing in real time. That's why I very often go back to my folder and I turn off a before and after. And you can see the difference we've made here. We've removed this harsh shadow considerably.
Wow.
And this is another tool in our arsenal that we can use to once again shape the light to shift focus to the things we want to. So let's say that this shadow is really distracting and it brings too much attention here, and I want it to start here and kind of move towards the face. I'm going to blend this to be a little softer. And suddenly that transition is a lot easier on the eyes. So now I've made this a smoother gradient, which helps lead your eye over in this direction.
What is the cleaning of the brush after each stroke? Why and what is that?
So you want to clean the brush because the mixer brush tool allows you to input your own color to mix in with it manually. But since we're working with an existing image, you want to only sample the color that is present in the skin that you're mixing. So the reset will do a transparent mixer brush color applied, and then it'll just take from whatever you press on and move that into a new space. If I had, let's say, a blue, it would start mixing blue into these skin tones and would start muddying the color.
Gotcha.
So to move on, I'm just going to do a little bit of light mixer brush tooling on these shadows to smooth things out. And another like beginner retouching fault that everyone has to experience is the plague of over retouching. It's something we all do and we all have to learn from. So once you first learn these tools, you're going to go wild with them and you're going to retouch everything and you're going to make your subject look so perfect that it doesn't necessarily look real. The key to being a well-versed retoucher is knowing when to stop and preserving those elements of realism. So I could retouch every single hair on her head, but then that wouldn't look natural anymore. So we want to keep some of these flyaways just to kind of root it in reality still and not make it look edited. So another technique I use, especially with the high frequency texture, is I do a clone stamp tool at a low opacity. So let's say there's too much texture going on here, but the under eyes do have a little bit of more texture than the rest of your cheek. I want to soften this here, not necessarily remove it entirely. If I wanted to get rid of it entirely, I'd just grab a patch tool, I'd just sample somewhere else, and then it's gone. But I like those little highlights. They add a little bit of interest here. They draw your eye over here. So I'm going to take a clone stamp tool and do a really low opacity of about 10%. And I'm going to sample from a smoother part. I'm going to lightly brush over this while sampling only from the current layer. And I'm going to just brush over a little bit. So we diminish this a tad, but it's not gone entirely. So the difference is how hard it pops here versus it's a little dulled down, but you still see it in the image. Same with the ones on this nose. I can sample from rough texture like this and paint it over, and it still dulls it down because of our very low opacity. So you're kind of just combining two different textures into one, and it usually comes out a lot smoother. So now these highlights pop a little less, but they're still present. So I think this is a pretty good place. With tonal, let's say I wanted to remove the highlights on these eyebrows, but the mixer brush tool isn't doing enough and I can't really cross into this area because it'll be too dark. I will use the tonal layer in between, so it exists still under the texture, kind of acting as a second tone layer, but it's entirely manual. So it'll allow me to paint my own custom tones in there. So I'll use some like common color values that are of skin tones.
And it's just a fully blank layer?
Yes, it is a perfectly blank layer, nothing's in it. And I will use a darker skin tone color at a very low opacity, let's say somewhere around 10 to 15, we can do 15, and then a low flow as well. So we're gonna make that also 15%. Oh, another Photoshop thing that I think might help people a lot is when you're working on a brush, and I know there's tons of forum posts about this, if you accidentally hit the caps lock button, your cursor disappears. So you can't really see what you're brushing or the size of your brush, and people think, oh, my brush is too big, my brush is too small. If I change the size of my brush, nothing happens to my cursor. It's that caps lock that's on that will bring it back.
And why is that?
I don't know. There's probably some practical application of it.
I
but
figured
I
for
just
sure
find that
you would know some
that's the one that
explanation
really
for it.
escapes me because I don't know what the benefit is to just losing your cursor entirely.
Yeah, it makes no sense.
And it's something you always hit on accident when you're trying to hit shift or tab or A.
100%.
So in our tonal layer, we have a darker skin tone color sampled at a low opacity and a low flow. And I'm going to come over to this area and I'm just going to start lightly painting. And you'll notice I get darker without affecting the texture again. Because if I was painting anything above the texture, a solid color on top of that would just start smoothing it out. But we want to just focus on our tone and our color here. So I'm painting over here with a darker brush, kind of painting these highlights down. And you'll see if I turn just the tonal layer on, you see these little dark spots, and that's what we painted on the transparent layer. And in our full image, we've just made those highlights diminish a little bit. You can also sample colors nearby to what you're working on using the Alt key in your brush, and that'll just open up your eyedropper tool to sample whatever color you highlight. It'll throw it in your color swatch here, and you can just keep painting with that if you want to match colors of certain areas. And that really helps smooth it out. And it's really good to work with sampled skin tones because you're not creating anything artificial, and you're using it helps the look, it helps the end product look a lot more natural. So we've gone from that to that, and we've used sampled skin tones, and it's still looks really natural.
Looks so good. I feel like this method would also be really good for editing sand dunes because I say that because I've recently been editing a lot of sand dunes with footprints, and it's a nightmare. The clone stamp tool, patch tool, like nothing works to keep the texture of the sand and like the color. And so this is a really good method that might work on that too.
It's funny you bring that up because I think the application that you're referring to is dodging and burning. And this tonal layer is great for dodging and burning. Other people have different dodging and burning processes. I myself have a different one that I've built an action for here where I use curves layers. So I have a dodge layer that brings the curve up and a burn layer that brings the curve down, and that'll just make the image brighter or darker wherever I paint it. So if I paint here with a high opacity, you'll see that this gets a lot brighter. And that's kind of how people typically dodge and burn, is just through like adjustment layers. It's actually really cool to dodge and burn using tonal because you can once again sample, like, let's say a bright skin tone color and a dark skin tone color, like the most shadowy area on her skin is this color. So it's not true black, but it's actually a really dark brown value. And you can use that to kind of burn down your subject in a much more natural way instead of just straight up black, which will adjust, like it'll kind of modify the color tone of what you're working on. Let's say I wanted to darken the side of her face and make it more obscured in shadow. I can just paint this darker brown color on the tonal layer, and now her face is darker, but not in a really like gritty way. You know, it looks still like actual skin tone.
Yeah, that's cool.
So that's what a tonal layer is really useful for. People use that to do a lot of like high level retouching, especially when it comes to very specific details, but it's also a great dodge and burn tool. So I think we've retouched this image quite a bit and it looks really good. I might work on the hair a little bit. So I'm going to create a new layer and just call that hair. I use the clone stamp tool for this, especially if it's on a simple background, and I'll just kind of brush away at those flyaways. And if you're doing your hair retouching on its own isolated layer, you want to make sure that this button is checked, and that is for sample all layers. Sample clone data from composited data. So this is really just to sample all layers. So this layer is blank. So if I try to clone stamp or spot heal, it won't have anything to sample from. If I have this button on, it'll take from the image underneath it and then apply that on top. So if I brush on top of these flyaways will start to disappear. And I just want to clean this up a little bit. I still want to keep some of those flyaways like I was talking about, but just the ones that are the most distracting. And then even internally inside of the silhouette, I'll sometimes fix hairs that go in a different direction or catch too much highlight. And it does a very, very good job of sampling and using AI to determine what belongs in the area that you're painting. And just like that, these little subtle adjustments definitely add up to a much better final product. So if we look at just what we've done, these are all the little brush marks we've made of the spot healing sampling. And we take that and take it to that. So all these little distracting highlights kind of just go away. And this is the level of detail that you will most likely need to have when you're working on a client project. That stuff definitely gets noticed. And then even on our, let's change this from here to just retouching in general. So this is our retouching layer now. I can use that same process to fix all the marks in the ground after the fact. And it's all isolated onto its own layer. So if we need to modify that after the fact, we have full control.
And I know yesterday, I believe you were just retouching or using the spot healing brush directly on your copied layer. And now today you're on a fresh layer. Is there a reason for that, or just kind of the method?
Yesterday's demo was just kind of to quickly touch on the potential that we have in Photoshop retouching. Cool. Today, I want to be focusing much more on a refined professional process. So this is normally how I would do it in my own work, is isolating things their own layers. It gives you a lot more independent control, which is great for revisions. If the client comes back and goes, I need this, like, let's say there's a spot here, we need to clean it up. Instead of going in and modifying all the edits we made on our subject, we can just go into its own layer and modify that. And we have the power to control the opacity of it. So if we want like a little bit of grit in the background, but less of it, we can control the opacity. And it's just all part of a, like I described yesterday, a non-destructive editing process and workflow.
Awesome.
So here we have what I would say is the finished product. I can group all those into a, when I'm done with a document, I like to group all my layers into a single group and just call that DNA for before and after. And I'll toggle that on and off just to see what we did to it. And just a lot of pretty delicate cleanup. If I zoom in here, you can see a lot better what we actually did. And it's just subtle changes that help clean up the image and make it look a little more refined.
Daniel, looks like we lost your camera output.
Oh, let me get that going one more time. In the meantime, are there any other questions we have technically?
Nothing right now, but let us know in the chat if you have any questions about this process and what Daniel did here. Very high-end stuff. Really, really great tips. I'm definitely learning a lot from this stream. And I cannot believe I didn't know about the mixer brush. Game changer.
Sorry about these camera issues. The webcam utility isn't always the best. And I'm working on finding more permanent solutions to this in the future.
Yeah, let us know if you need a couple seconds if needs
yeah,
to be
just
adjusted.
a minute would be good. I just have to unplug and plug some stuff back in.
Okay.
It's funny because we were troubleshooting this earlier and I figured out that there's a really specific order you have to do this in. And it's like you have to plug in the camera, then turn on the webcam, then turn on the physical camera.
Okay, we are going to go to standby. We'll be back in a few moments. All right, we are back and in business.
Hey everyone, sorry about the delay. But yeah, just to recap on what we were doing here, we have a image in Photoshop that we've fully retouched now. We did a lot of subtle adjustments with frequency separation. We did a little bit of tonal adjustments on the skin. And then we did some cleanup retouching here with the spot healing tool. So now that this is all ready, we can save that into our edited folder and move on to another image. Should we get into the special surprise we had?
Yes, I'm super excited.
So one thing that I want to highlight today with Photoshop is the ability to produce GIFs from still images inside of Photoshop. And this is a lengthy process, so this might take us almost through the rest of the stream, but I think this is very, very much worth talking about. So I have here in Lightroom a series of raw images that were all shot in a burst fire mode that go from here to here of our subject running across a trail. And with the rise of motion being a component in the commercial world, clients are very often going to want to see some form of motion, even if it's not outright video. GIFs are still very popular in the industry. So being able to make a GIF out of your still frames without having to learn video entirely is definitely a very valuable tool in your kit. So the first step is to just shoot a lot of images in a row that go in a sequence. From there in Lightroom, what I like to do to organize them all is I like to put them into a stack, and I can show you how to do that right now. I've already kind of prepped these files, but I'll start from scratch for you guys. So we have our images in sequence here from start to finish. And this is basically how the image is going to play out. I usually pick my keyframe just so I know which shot it is. So this is be my hero image of the GIF. And I'll select that one and right click that in the film strip. Under stacking, I'll do group into stack. And what it does is it kind of compresses them all behind each other in the film strip just to keep things a little cleaner and more organized. And you can click on the stack icon to open up that stack to see all the individual frames. And while doing that, what we're going to do is make sure that all of our images are selected in that stack. And I'm going to go on.
Just a quick question with that. You could do that, say, with similar images as well, like for a client shoot or something. If you had one scene, you could stack those together to keep your Lightroom more organized, or?
Yes. Okay. You can, it's kind of a similar tool to collections here. But if they're all in the same folder already, you can definitely group them. You can use stacks to group them by look, essentially. So if the client says we're doing 5 looks or 5 styles, you can take all of, like, let's say your blue scene, you can group those into a stack, and all of your red scene, you can group all of those into a stack. And then in your film strip, everything is a lot more organized.
Okay.
So for the sake of our motion GIF from stills, we're going to select a keyframe and make sure that all of our images in that stack are selected. I'm going to go off our keyframe here and then into the develop module. While these are still all selected, I will have this auto sync button turned on, and that's controlled by this switch here. So if it's off by default, it'll just say sync, and you can use that to manually sync images once you're done editing. If you have this switch on, auto sync will update all of the images that are selected in real time with the one that you are currently editing. So let's say I wanted to decrease the exposure of this a little bit. You'll get this notification saying exposure updated for 12 images. And you'll see in the film strip that all those images were brought down about 0.5 stops between every single image. So they'll all update in accordance with one another, which really helps for your motion GIF, because you want all of your images in your motion GIF to look exactly the same in processing so that it just plays out smoothly, and you're more focused on the transition of the animation or the motion rather than the look of it. Because if one frame is darker than another, the GIF is going to flash, and that's really noticeable and really distracting. So you want to make sure that your frames are as close to one another in visual look as possible. So to actually edit this image, I'm going to bring down the highlights. We're going to go for a really natural look on this. No intense editorial color grading or anything like that. We're going to keep it really simple and clean. I'm going to bring down the contrast about 15 points. I'm going to bring up the whites. I'm still looking at this histogram here. Just make sure we're not clipping anything. We look pretty good. I'm going to bring down the black point just because we could use the extra contrast. I'm going to warm up the image because this was shot at sunset. And then I'm going to bring up the vibrance. I'm seeing a little bit of a green tint here, so I'm also going to move this towards magenta just to balance out the white point and make sure that our sunset is looking very warm. And a cool thing about this tool is you can actually, when you crop, all the crops will update as well. So if I'm focusing on my frame here and I'm getting too much on the bottom, I can cut that out. I can bring this in. I can confirm that, and then it will update across all of these images.
That's a great
I want to make
feature.
sure I'm not cutting out too much towards the end of my frame. Now, if you're prepping a GIF that you know you're going to animate in Photoshop, I would actually suggest against doing any composition changes in Lightroom. You can do all of your composition changes in Photoshop once the motion GIF is built, and that makes it easier to visualize everything. But I'm looking between the frames and it doesn't seem like anything's changing too much between the look, no exposure differences, no color shifts. So we're in a really good place. So I'm going to, once all the images are ready to go and you're happy with the overall look and feel, we're going to take these while they're all selected and edit them in Photoshop. And you don't want to go to edit in a Photoshop because that will open every single image as its own document. And then your computer will spend the rest of the day loading them all in. You want to open them as layers in Photoshop, which is your bottom button here. That will take them all into one document and just stack them up on top of each other. I will say though, depending on the camera that you're using to shoot, the resolution of it, the size of the files of your camera's images, and the amount of frames that you're taking will vary greatly from person to person, and that will have a significant effect on your hardware. So I'm using a Canon R5, which has a 45 megapixel sensor. So the files individually are already pretty big. On top of that, I'm doing, I think, 12 frames, which is kind of like mid-level in terms of amount. But if you're doing an animation that's up to 30 frames, 40 frames, that's going to wear really heavily on your device. So if hardware is an issue, I would suggest sizing your images down before you do this and then loading them in.
Yeah, that's a really good tip. I think depending on the age of your computer or type of computer you have as well. I know I just updated my MacBook and that made a huge difference on how long it took Photoshop to process anything.
So I actually have the chat open while we're waiting for these to load in and render. Do you mind if I jump into some of these questions?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
So Gerard asks, do you work for yourself? How do you get into the field of Photoshop editing? I do work for myself. I'm a full-time freelance creative, photographer and videographer and retoucher. And the way that I got into it was finding people in my city who also work in the industry, finding other established photographers, videographers, and retouchers, emailing them, setting up meetings, and just asking like, hey, is there any way I can help you? What can I do for you? Without asking for much in return on the front end, knowing that they will eventually return the favor, and just trying to help as many people around me as possible. Also, you need to be good at it, what you do, no matter what. So practicing constantly. I edit pictures nearly every single day, and then I stream that process about once a week or so. So making sure that I'm regularly working on this, staying up to date, not losing that edge is super important.
Are you reading the chats from YouTube?
I am.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I have Behance, so that's good that you saw that.
Cool. So we have all of our images loaded into a document here. I'm just trying to make sure they're in the right order. This one loaded out of order, and I think it's because of the way I stacked it. So another thing for organization's sake that you might run into is I try to have the keyframe as the first image in the stack. So just so I know which one I was working on. That kind of becomes an issue because it reorders them in your film strip. And then when you load them as layers into Photoshop, it'll do it based on that order. So this image is in the middle of the animation, but in Photoshop, it got loaded in first. So this is 1432. So it actually goes right here. So now with the file names in order, the numbers are in order. So yeah, now it's playing out as it should, as I'm just previewing it. So a feature about Photoshop that a lot of people don't know about is the timeline window. And you can find that up here in the window panel at the top of your screen. going down to timeline here. And this will open up a little timeline tool on the bottom. This is for creating video and GIFs inside of Photoshop or frame animations. A lot of people don't actually know that you can work on video in Photoshop. That is definitely a function if you don't have access to Premiere or Rush. And clicking this little hamburger menu icon in the timeline panel, you want to, actually, I'm getting a little out of order. Before you do that, if all of the images, I'm doing a tracking shot, which might not work for what I'm doing, but if you have a static frame and something's just moving inside of the frame, so let's say I was on a tripod and she just ran across, the first step that I always do is select all my layers. I go to edit, and then I'll go to auto align layers. And it might work for this, but it might not. I like to do auto projection and click OK, and it'll take, let's say if you're doing handheld, but you're trying to move as little as possible, you might get little shifts in your frame here and there, and you'll see like the camera shake when it plays. That will snap all of the elements of your image into the same place so that your frame stays static, and then whatever moves a little smoother. So yeah, it didn't work necessarily as well with this just because I was moving my frame, but you can see it actually did a good job of lining up the bridge and these to as they move in the frame. So you'll see that the background is fully completed. And these things are actually lined up really well, these little poles. Yeah. It's just that my subject is moving through the frame. So this is something you do if you wanted a more static frame. This is not a static frame, so we're going to undo all that. All right, so right before our auto align layers, we were here. We're not going to auto align layers for this because we have a moving animation. So the only button in our timeline available is create frame animation or video timeline. Since we're doing a GIF, we're going to do a frame animation. If you wanted to create a proper video or an MP4 or an MOV, you would do a video timeline, but we're going to do frame animation for now. So you'll see that we have our one frame, and it's going off of whatever layer we have highlighted. So to put all of these layers into motion, we're going to go to our hamburger menu icon here, and we're going to go to this button that says make frames from layers. So it's going to take all of our layers, and it's going to dedicate a frame to each of those. So now we have 12 frames because we have 12 images. Each is their own frame, and we have a little play button down here that we can play. So if I play this out, you can see this playing. Now it's playing in reverse, and that's because of the way that it loaded the layers in. So it'll create frames from layers in the order that your layers exist in the layer panel here. So it'll bottom to top, chronological order. Since this was loaded in backwards, it's playing in reverse, but there's a really easy tool to fix this in this hamburger menu icon that says reverse frame. So it'll just invert everything in your animation. Now our animation will play forward to back.
So cool.
And now we have an animation going. And this is why I said earlier that I like doing my cropping after the animation is built. So now I can just tab through and kind of see really quickly where the edges of my true frame are. So in the beginning, I'm a little farther away, but by the end, I'm like really close. So I can probably cut in the original ratio. I can probably cut in a little bit from the top now that I know that this is like my safe space. And then the bottom is pretty fine. Maybe I can come in a little bit here. But now I'm going to confirm that. And now if we play our animation, it has to render those out really quickly. And now we see our person running, all from still frames. You have created motion from stillness.
I love it. That's so awesome.
If the speed is something that, if it feels a little too quick for you, that's normal. The default speed for your frame animation is 0 seconds between each frame. So each frame will just automatically play into the next one. We can actually control the frame rate of each frame by clicking on this timing at the bottom of each frame, and it has a drop-down menu, and it'll give us a couple preset options for different timings, common timings, and then other, which lets you put in a custom frame delay. So we have full control over this, and it's a really comprehensive tool within Photoshop. So if I wanted to say, wait half a second from the first frame to the next frame, just so you're looking at it, and then it plays, it'll do that. So it waits, then it plays. And let's say in the middle, I wanted to pause on this keyframe here. I'll do another 1 second pause here. So it'll be a half second for this, plays out, waits a second, then continues on. And then the other delays are just kind of the computer rendering it out. So half a second, wait, plays out the rest. And if you're going for that really common like stop motion, like it looks like a GIF effect, I think these preset timings are pretty good. You can select all of your layers at once. I do that by just clicking. You can do control and clicking multiple frames. You can also just click the first frame that you want to select, the last frame you want to select, and hold the shift key and click that last one, and it'll select everything in between. So that's just another way to do this a lot faster than clicking every single one. And if you're working on 30, 40, 50 frames, it's hard to click every single one. You just do first to last, shift key, click them all in. So once they're all selected, there'll be a light gray color. You can click on this drop down for timing and do a 0.1 or a 0.2. I think 0.2 is pretty good, I've found in my experience. So if they're all set to a 0.2 delay, you get that really jerky stop motion feel once this renders out. So now you have a little more time to focus on each frame. You get a sense that they are just pictures and not just a weird looking video. And this is kind of the standard format that a lot of clients like delivered when they're asking for GIFs.
Do you find that clients are often asking for GIFs?
I think it's a way more common now than it used to be.
Right.
And it's a weird in between because more clients today are asking for videos, but not all photographers are videographers as well. And the clients kind of don't necessarily care about that. And they're just being more and more demanding of photographers, asking them to transcend medium. So this is a really comfortable way to step into that space and maybe offer a little more to your client without becoming a full-time dedicated videographer or learning all about video and that whole industry. So this is saying, I'm a photographer and you're hiring me photography, and then they're like, we want motion. I can provide an element of motion at the very least.
I like that. That's good. Yeah, they always want video on top of it. I'm like, really?
And this is a great justification saying this is the kind of video that I can offer you if you need something in motion. And when it comes to stuff like Instagram, this can be easily converted into a video asset. So it uploads as a reel, or TikTok for that matter. So this is just kind of like a really great offering you can make. So from there, you could, you don't necessarily save this the way you normally would. So if you go to just the regular save as dialog box for this document, you can drop down, or in the save as copy, you can do the drop down. I think the GIF format, yeah, you can do GIF format like this. This will not save the animation. If you do it like this will only save the layer that is visible in your current timeline as a still image in a GIF format. So the file format will be GIF, but it'll be one frame, and it's a frame that you have visible. The correct way to export this GIF so that you preserve the animation and it plays out correctly is actually in the save for web dialog box, which is in the export dropdown. So in export, it's save for web legacy. And it'll open up this new window here. And this will take a minute to load because it's trying to render out your GIF. This is where it gets a little more hardware intensive because it's actually rendering stuff out. So this part takes a little while, and making revisions on GIFs is a nightmare. When your client comes back and they're like, can we remove this one frame? And it's like, I can, but then I have to wait for this every single time I want to make that change.
Right.
And this is why in yesterday's stream, I talked a lot about making sure that your revisions are outlined, or at least your rounds of revisions are outlined and your scope of work is outlined. Because once you start going past those things and you're doing all this stuff you didn't expect to do, that time really adds up, especially in a process like this. So I'm going to make this box a little smaller because that's usually how I like to preview it. So we have to make some changes here because a 4,000 or a 5,000 by 7,000 GIF is way too big for most formats, especially web, like very not web friendly. You got to keep in mind when your stuff is going on a website, it needs to load quickly. So you need to make your file sizes as small as possible so they pop up. And GIFs are way bigger than pictures usually. So you have to account for that. These all preset settings are fine. GIF, selective. Some people like perceptual. And those are, I don't necessarily know the math and science behind these settings yet. I haven't done a ton of research into it. But perceptual or the other one that I just forgot the name of, those are perfectly fine settings. Diffusion is always good. Transparency is okay. I normally don't do transparency dither. I know other people do. If you're interested in making more GIFs in this process, I would definitely look into these settings because they will affect your output dramatically. And another thing about saving GIFs is every single time you change one of these settings, it has to reload the entire GIF. So you can only do these one at a time. Now, the reason that this is taking so long to process out is because of how big it is. So if I'm going to change any of these settings, the first one I'm always going to do is the size to make it as small as possible so it loads quicker every time I make a change. I usually like to do 1500 to 2000 on the longest side. So I'm going to do 1500 just to make this a little bit quicker.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people get hung up on the exporting stuff, including myself.
It is very tricky. And I mean, these file formats are very complex. So you notice that it got smaller. And that's because we physically made the GIF smaller. And this little preview flyout menu, I'd like to do fit and view just so I can see it in its entirety. And we have a little animation tab here, which is great. So our looping options, we can do forever. We can do once. We can do 3 times, any amount of numerical times you want. But if it's a true GIF, it'll loop forever. But let's say you wanted to play on a website only 3 times. You can input that for the export. That way the GIF will only play 3 times every time it's loaded up. And then we can do a play animation just to preview and make sure it works in this box. So we can see here at our frame rate, it does play out fully. And this is always something I test before I export, just to make sure it works. So we can see our still images playing out in an animation as they're supposed to here. All of our settings are perfectly good with that. And we are going to save that. I'm going to put this in our folder next to all of our edits. And it'll have the same file name, .gif at the end. And that, I believe, has exported. Yep, and we can see it here. There is our GIF playing out in a video player.
It looks awesome.
Another good way to preview these if your native video player is having issues with this is you can always drag a GIF into your browser and it'll just play out in your browser window. And keep in mind, we only exported this out at 1500 pixels at the longest side, which is relatively small for an image. But it's a GIF, and look at the detail and resolution you're getting in this GIF. I mean, you can see all of the noise and the grain and the texture of the camera. So it's a pretty high res video, quote unquote video.
Yeah.
With all of our custom edits and everything from Lightroom. So I'm going to go back to Lightroom actually. So that was just the demonstration for that one image. I have a horizontal version here that is 16 frames long. So I'm going to unstack these just so they load into Photoshop in the right order. I'll do the first image to load the stack. Expand that. So we're going to do the same process again with another shot. It's the same scene, but it'll be horizontal, so it'll be easier for people to see on stream. And I'm going to go off of our keyframe here, our hero image here in the animation. I like this one a lot. This one looks really good. And we'll do a little more editorial sense, editorial styled edit. And we can actually pull from some of the stuff we made yesterday. So we did a very cool toned look like this in some of our earlier shots. And I saved that as a preset inside of Lightroom so I can use that look in future projects, including this one. So I'm going to load that one up. And now, since our auto sync button was on, I see that all of our images have that exact same preset applied to it. So they all match one another. And any other additional changes I make will be synced between them. So let's say I pull the exposure down a little bit. I want to make it a darker image. I'll pull the blacks down and the shadows. I'll pull up the highlights, but bring down the whites. And I will maybe make it a little more cool toned. This neon top, I'm going to decrease the saturation of a little bit too, just so it's not as distracting. Maybe change the hue to a more, maybe like a deeper green. Like that. So now we see we've changed the color of her top entirely, but between all of the images. So I'm going to load them back into Photoshop as layers. Another thing too is this process of making GIFs in Photoshop will fill up your scratch disks really fast too. So make sure that this is like the only document that's open. You don't have any other Adobe programs running that might be taking up some of your RAM or taking up some of your scratch disk space, and really dedicate your computer to this process if you're working on it. I've run into issues.
Yeah, I was just going to say, do you have any tips for dealing with scratch disks? It seems to always be a thing.
So for people that don't understand what scratch disk is, scratch disk does not use your GPU or your CPU or your processor. It actually uses your hard drive for storage. So if you're the kind of person who's always out of space and has no room in their internal or their externals, scratch disk space is going to be a huge issue for you. I would dedicate all of your project files onto an external so that you keep your internal, whatever device you're using, as empty as possible. It really should just be a dedicated workstation. So that's why like external hard drives and little SSDs are like a photographer's best friend. You can keep all of your RAWs, all of your Photoshop files, all of your edits, your exports on something else, while freeing up your computer's internal space for working. So you can see here on my computer, I have an internal drive that is 500 gigs, and I only have 76 left. And I think I have so little because of this previous document and the other stuff we've been working on in Photoshop, and it fills up really quick. I was actually working on a big commercial job last week, and I had 200 gigabytes free on my internal hard drive. And I was making motion GIFs in Photoshop using full res raw files. And that quickly filled up. So on one of the documents, I was trying to save it, and it said Photoshop could not save this document. There is no scratch disk space left. And I was like, well, I need to do something with it. Like, I'm out of room. Like, it has to get saved. I can't just delete it. I've worked for hours on this. So what I had to do, I had to go into my internal hard drive and just clear up space with other stuff. So I started deleting other kinds of documents, other junk, other programs that I didn't need at the moment, and freed up enough space on my internal drive to just save that document. Once I got that document saved, I closed Photoshop, turned off my computer, reset everything, turned it back on, and that will, resetting your computer will completely free up your disk space.
Okay.
Another people that run into scratch disk issues all the time are people that never restart their computer. And I am a very big proponent of always turning off your computer when you're not using it.
I feel like you're talking directly to me with this. Between the storage and the computer not turning off, this is all the things that I do wrong.
These are all things that will help make your life a lot easier when it comes to working inside of any sort of creative apps. So scratch the space. If you're running into those issues, restart your computer regularly. Make sure you empty your hard drive, use externals if you have to. Those are all things that will certainly help you not run into those problems.
Yeah.
So it seems like all of our files are loaded into Photoshop here. So we're going to do the exact same process. I'm going to create a frame animation. I'm going to make frames from layers. This will take all these and play them out. It's playing backwards again because of the way that it loaded in. So I'm going to do reverse frames. And if you find this extra step tedious and you're running into it all the time, the workaround for that is when you're going into Lightroom and you're picking the image to click to do edit in and then open as layers, always do the last one. So if you have a stack, pick the last image in your stack and then go off of that one. It will load them in from first to last, and then you will have your layers in the correct order. So I'm playing this out, and We have all of our Lightroom color grading applied to every single image. There's no flashing or strobing. Everything's pretty much in the same spot. And I'm just going to adjust the timing between them about 0.2. Another thing that will help us work faster is, I know we mentioned resizing the GIF while we're exporting. We can actually do this beforehand in the image panel, image size, and we can change the image size of the whole document. So let's just bring this down to whatever we're going to be working at. Probably, let's just say 2500 on the longest side. And that might take another second too. Gerard on YouTube is asking, can we get the full copied link version of this image tutorial as editable layers so we can practice? I can't do it with this shoot, but if you follow me on Behance, I can upload in a future stream of mine the assets, and I'll be doing another tutorial of this on my stream that you'll be able to download and follow along with me.
Nice.
So now when I play it out, it runs a little smoother and it's just smaller. So we lose a little bit of the fine details, but even still, if I zoom in, we still get a lot of data in here. We can see the people across the river. We can read the labels of the shops. So this is still a usable quality in my opinion. So I'm going to play this out. Looks good at 0.2. And an advanced GIF technique that I actually learned recently that I'm going to share with y'all is when you create frames from layers, what it's doing is it's showing the document and it's just changing the visibility of each layer. So just this layer is visible in frame 3. Just this layer is visible in frame 4. And that's how it creates these frame animations. A difficult thing that people run into is if I create a layer, let's say I want to create a vignette on this whole document, and we'll do it in the same way we did yesterday. I'm going to grab an elliptical marquee tool, have a feather pretty high at about 750 pixels, maybe even 1000 for this document, or 800. I'm going to drag it from corner to corner. I'm going to create a levels layer. Actually, I should do a little bit less of a feather because it's a smaller document. I'll probably do like a 300 pixel feather. Create my mask. So this is currently my mask. I'm going to invert it so it's just working on the edges. And then I'm going to bring this down to really shift the focus towards the center of the frame. You'll notice that that layer is visible on the entire animation. So we have kind of a layer on top of everything. So if I wanted to add adjustments, let's say I'll make it brighter, that still plays on top of our entire frame animation. So we can still make edits to our animation after the fact with these adjustment layers in Photoshop. So you can further, quote unquote, retouch your GIF animation. So I'm going to do an inverted vignette, and I'm going to brighten the center just to draw more focus there. Just very subtly. And I'm also going to increase the vibrance because I feel like we lost a little bit of the color there. Yeah, now the skin tones are really popping out. So we have these 3 adjustment layers on top of our entire document, but the frames are still based off of the ones that we used to make the animation before we added these. So now this plays out with our vignette and our vibrance on top of everything. And this is how you would really like nail the look and feel. So if you're worried about having to do all this prep work in Lightroom, or if you only have access to Photoshop, you can load all these files into Photoshop, create your animation. And once that animation is created, you can do all of your color processing on top of that animation in Photoshop, if that's a preferred method for you.
Yeah, that's really good to know. Also, Mike mentioned you could add a depth map and add some atmosphere.
I'm not as familiar with depth maps and atmosphere. I'm going to look into that though, and I appreciate the suggestion. I'll probably do that in a future stream of mine. But I know what he's talking about. I'm familiar with the concept. I just don't have practice with it, but he's talking about kind of creating some special masks that exist behind her and this foreground and this background area, and adding maybe like a level of fog or something like that, or even just changing the brightness to make her glow in the animation.
Yeah, and depth matte. I haven't done it that way. I'll have to check that out too.
So our animation is playing out. It works perfectly well. I can probably crop in a little bit. I'm looking at the first frame and I don't really want to include these people in it. And then I'm looking at the last frame and seeing how much edge I can take away, especially in like these keyframes here. And I can probably lose a little bit off the left. Keep in mind when you're cropping the document, it crops everything. So we're losing this area in the first frames, in the middle frames, and the last frame. So I can come in a little bit over here. And the only thing is you can't preview other frames while you're cropping. So you need to have a really good grip on like where your subject falls and where the animation is happening. So now when I play that out, she's pretty much center frame in all of this, which is good. I'm not losing her head on any of these shots. I can also modify the animation while I'm making it, because let's say the animation should stop here and this shot, she kind of falls out of line with everything. I can just take this frame and drag it to the trash bin icon. And now we have decreased our animation from 16 to 15 frames. So now it loops, and I don't think I'm too happy with this first animation, first frame either, just because her eyes are closed. So we can drop that one too. And now we keep a very intense look throughout our entire animation. So same process. To export this, we would need to go to Save for Web Legacy. You can find it in the export flyout down here. I like to use the keyboard shortcut, which is Alt, Shift, Control, and S. All those are really clustered together, so it's like a fun little finger exercise. And all of our settings from the last export have saved to this one, so I don't need to change any of these. And this is where I like to keep it comfortably. The only thing I'm ever really changing usually is the image size. So I'm going to change this to about, once again, 1500 on the longest side. Have that re-render out. And this goes a lot faster since we're not starting with an 8000 by 5000 image. We're just going from a 2500 by, I think, like 1500 image that we resized earlier in the document. So those are all just tips that are a little more hardware friendly.
Yeah, very helpful.
And that has exported. Let's go find that in our folder just to confirm that that went well. And that looks really good. I'm going to play that in a browser really quick just to test that as well. Yeah, I think that looks great.
Yeah, I love it. Looks so good.
And then even if it was like, let's say a commercial client, like in Photoshop, like I was saying, you can build layers on top of your animation and they won't change through it. You could put a little Nike logo in the corner just so that's on top of everything, or a little bit of like copy that says something about the message of the campaign you're working on, all on top of this animation, all inside of just Photoshop. No video editing skills required.
Amazing. Always happy to see no video required.
What's up?
So if you feel like you're at a good point, we can jump into the artist spotlight, and then we'll go back over to you. Are you good with that?
Yeah, that's fine by me.
Okay, awesome. So let's jump over to our artist of the week.
So this is our artist of the week. His name is Tom Mikus. He is a fashion and beauty photographer based here in Chicago, Illinois. He works with more of like a high-end luxury style, focusing very much on color and lighting. He actually is a mentor of mine and has taught me a lot about retouching. So a lot of the tips that I'm giving you, some of those have come from him either directly or very indirectly over the years of working together. His work is just so like fascinating in terms of color, like the color blocking and the levels of saturation without looking too oversaturated or overdone is just amazing to me every time. He's so good at just keeping things right at the edge of not overdoing it.
Yeah.
And his skin retouching is phenomenal. I mean, you won't find a flaw in any faces that he works on.
It's insane. I'm like totally blown away, and I love the colors and his style overall. Like it caught my eye right away.
And that's actually how I got involved with him. So I discovered Tom, even though we live in the same city. I had never heard of him before through any of our mutual contacts. I discovered him here on Behance. When I first got on the platform and I was looking for people, he popped up in my, like curated list of the For You. And just one of these like thumbnails just really stood out to me in a project. I think it was actually, if I can recall, it was probably this project, I think, or this project. But I just saw like the skin retouching in this and I was like, oh my God, the skin is so perfect in this. Like, I want to know how to edit like that. So
Yeah.
I ended up DMing him on Behance and I said, hey, I really love your retouching process. I myself am a retoucher and still looking to get, improve more and grow in the industry. Can we set up a Zoom call? Can we talk, have a meeting? And he said, yeah, we set up a Zoom call. We chatted. We talked about editing. We talked about retouching. And then shortly after that, he kind of brought me on for some jobs that he needed some assistance with. And we've been working together ever since.
Wow, I love that. That is so cool, and really just goes to show the power of the community through Behance and being able to message someone and get such a positive response and then get mentored by them and work with them. Like very, very cool.
So should we go back to some more editing?
If we can just spend a few moments here going through some of his work and just clicking on some stuff so that the audience can all see it, and we can point out some of the things that we like and what maybe you could give some of your tips of what you feel is making it a really good photo or edit. I'm sure people would like to hear that.
Oh, totally. And it's really beneficial that I know him personally because I have actually given a lot of feedback on these projects before they were published. We do some peer review pretty frequently when we're working on our own projects. So I was actually showing him the pictures that we did yesterday and going back and forth about stuff we can improve in today's stream and see with like these images. We were talking about it and I was explaining the elements that really worked in this image were, first off, perfect masks. I mean, this was not shot on a blue backdrop, I don't believe. He likes to do a lot of background replacements. So he cuts a lot of his stuff out through masks, through pen tools, through color selections, and he does extremely refined masks. I mean, catching all of these like edges of the beard hair here and these ruffles in the back. A very composite heavy workflow.
It's so good. It's like perfectly cut out.
And then in addition, Tom uses a lot of frequency separation techniques that I displayed here on stream, especially more so on the tonal end. He does a very tonal heavy workflow, which allows him to get these perfect like balances of light and color on the face without ruining the skin tone at all. Like you can see if I zoom in here, there's still so much great skin detail here that you see while still looking perfectly smooth.
Yeah. I bet he gets so many jobs through his work. Like
he does. And that's actually how I became more involved with him is as a retoucher. I wouldn't say we're far and few between, but like at the higher levels, like retouchers are more and more in demand because the demand for high quality assets has increased exponentially through social media. Companies are constantly putting out content and material that they need edited on their standards of quality. And there's only so many retouchers that can take in all that work. So with Tom, over the past year, he's seen a major jump in his business and he's brought me in to help him kind of bear some of the load. So very often we find each other retouching on similar projects, or if he needs an assistant retoucher to kind of come in, and what we've done in the past is he'll get a job and he'll say, I need you to prep files and then I'll complete them. So he'll give me some raws and I'll do just frequency separation. And then I'll pass that working file back to him where he'll do the rest of the global things like final color palettes, replacing the background, making sure all the individual elements are clean and to the right levels, and then overall like global adjustments.
That's an interesting way to work. That's cool.
And it is like a unique insight that a lot of people don't know who aren't industry involved of work will pass through so many hands before it's put out. I feel like a lot of people get into photography thinking, I'm going to be a photographer and a big company is going to come to me and hire me to shoot stuff. And then I'm going to work on it in Lightroom at home. And then I'm going to email it to them and then they're going to put it on a billboard. And it's like, there's so much more to that where like a client goes to an agency goes to an art buyer finds a director or a creative director or a photographer, and then a photographer hires a producer or a CD to put together a project, and they get talent like agency models, then they shoot that project, and then they hand that off to a retoucher, and then that retoucher might work with multiple retouchers to make sure that all those assets come out uniform and high quality. Then that goes through rounds of review with everyone, including the client, and then eventually it makes its way to print.
Yep. It takes a village.
But yeah, here's an example of some of Tom's stuff that has been purposed for an actual advertisement. So this was just the plain retouching job, and then this was with final copy on top of it.
And so do you think in one like this and some of the other ones that are on the colored background, I know you said with the guy in the blue background, it could have been added in. What are your thoughts on this one?
Oh, almost certainly.
Okay.
I would say probably 80 to 90% of these projects have some form of background manipulation. So with Tom's work, it's very color heavy, and he spends a lot of time really dialing in the colors in every single element of his image, especially the background. So with a shoot like this, I believe he did shoot this on a yellow backdrop, but he still has to mask out the subject and isolate the background to its own layer in Photoshop. And he spends a lot of time tweaking that color to dial it in just how he wants it in a way that really perfectly complements the subject's skin tones. Because you see elements of realism here with like some fall off on the top and then like a shadow interaction to the backdrop. And that's real, but this is still isolated and very heavily manipulated. Tom also does a lot of product work on top of beauty images. He does a lot of beauty product imagery. So things in the commercial beauty space that have products attached to them, whether it's facial cleansers or moisturizers and stuff like that, or even scents and fragrances. He photographs those as well and does a phenomenal job retouching those too.
Yeah. And again, I love his use of color in these, because I think so often we think of and see product photography in kind of a boring way, sometimes on white backgrounds, and so unique with his contrasting colors and the shadows. Very cool.
And I think secondary to his color skill, his lighting skills are phenomenal. I've had the pleasure of being on set with him before and getting to see firsthand like how his lighting setups work, and they are very, very complex and very like thought out, where he has like lights with modifiers firing through massive screens to like soften the already soft light even further, placing them in all sorts of areas you would never expect, or like doubling up lights with two different modifiers to have like a very unique like mixture effect on the subject.
Wow, that's super cool.
And then he's always trying to push himself to kind of build on top of what he already has. So a lot of his work is seen as portraits on backdrops, and then occasionally he will add additional elements into it, like a tabletop or something for the subject to interact with if it's not just focused on their face and if it's not strictly a beauty campaign. So he'll add a surface for them to interact with, a reflection. He'll sometimes build like sets. I actually worked with him on this project for an apparel company that does kids clothing, and we built this wall that has real trim on it and the real floor that we painted ourselves.
Oh and my then God.
These wooden cubes that we also painted very specific shades to go along with the theme of the shoot.
Wow.
And then once again, really complex lighting situations. I mean, this was like, I think like a 4 or 5 light setup.
Wow.
you would guess just from these shadows that it's like, oh, it's just one light just shooting from the side, and that's where the shadow is. But there's so much extra fill going on. It just lends itself to more complexity in terms of the way that it interacts in the subject's face and making it look so clean.
Yeah. And where did he learn all of his skills from?
He learned a lot of his skills from his mentors. Oh, there's a crew shot, and there's him, and there's me.
Oh, that's cool. It's awesome.
So he learned a lot of his skills. We actually are both alumni of the same institution, art school here in Chicago.
Okay.
So he got a lot of his education from a similar background that I have, but even before that, he's worked with a lot of very prominent commercial photographers in the industry for the past couple of years, even longer than I have. So he has a lot of very strong real world skills and connections that he's kind of picked up elements from here and there, like working for one photographer, you learn their lighting trick for this, and working for this photographer, you learn their retouching skill for this. And you just kind of compile all that things in your own style, and you're always like collecting different tools from the people you work around.
Totally. I was just looking at his website. He has a lot of very cool stop motion as well.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about kind of this GIF work, and coincidentally, we each kind of learned those things on our own. But after we've come together, we pass each other back and forth like different techniques or different ideas we could do for GIFs using stills.
Just love his work. So cool.
And even I've been showing a lot of his most recent work, but even some of his older work is so refined and so clean. Like, it's not a new thing how good his stuff is. His stuff has been consistently good for so long. I mean, like, even I don't know how to like light this kind of scene and get this like super perfect look.
It's amazing. I'm totally blown away. He's like one of those people that I'm putting into my forever, never ending list of artists that I can look at when I need that boost of inspiration or like just some fuel for the day. You know, he has that kind of work that fires you up.
I mean, this is like a phenomenal example of the color blocking that he does. Just like this deep, deep red on this light, airy blue with really natural skin tones, great makeup, like solid blush, and then expertly styled jewelries and accessories.
Absolutely.
I definitely have him in a lot of my mood boards, and you should too.
Yeah.
And I mean, even Tom has done, I know he mostly does beauty stuff, but he has done some fitness work before too. And, you know, two people can work in the same space and produce wildly different things. So like you've seen the work that I've been producing in the past 2 days, and that kind of fits more into my style, but this is an entirely different take on what fitness imagery looks like.
Yeah, it's so unique.
This was a very out of the box shoot for him. We were talking for a while when he was planning it, saying that like, I think this is going to be way different than what I usually do. And he showed me some mock-ups for it. And I was like, oh yeah, this is very much like a venture out, like pushing yourself past the creative bounds. And I think this is one of his more favorite ones as of late.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Less focus on the color blocking and more focus on the lighting and the mood of the photo.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very powerful.
And I mean, this is the same model, just without the makeup on.
Wow. I love seeing the difference.
Right? That's another thing about photography that people don't really realize is it's very team oriented. Like,
yeah,
people get into photography as a solo experience, but as you venture more and more into the industry, you realize how much collaboration is involved. Like on set, you could be working with up to 10 or more people on a single shoot, between you, an assistant, up to 3 assistants I've seen.
Yeah.
Digital techs, gaffers, makeup artists, stylists, directors, creative directors, so on. The list goes on and on. But like a lot of like minds go into making work that looks like this.
Totally. Yeah, I used to work on big commercial shoots, and it always blew me away how many people would be on set and each of their specific roles.
Tom and I actually have been retouching a really big commercial project recently that is not out and I cannot talk about it. But when it is, I will be promoting it on my social channels and you'll get to see some of the true commercial work that I do and along with Tom.
Cool. These are beautiful.
Another thing that really helps too is the talent that you work with. They can definitely make or break a shoot. This model I actually know personally and have worked with myself in the past, and he pops up a lot in Tom's work, and that's just because he makes the shoot so much easier on everybody. He's an actor as well, which really helps him get into the personality of the subject he's trying to portray. And stuff like that saves time, makes the quality better, just overall improvement to set.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so great. So we have about 12 minutes left. If you have anything else that you want to work on today or anything else that you want to show everyone.
Yeah, I actually was working with, so if we're going along with the idea of a Nike style editorial, with a company as big as Nike, they have a wide range of styles that they output for different audiences. So if that's a company that you want to work with, I do not suggest looking at Nike stuff and going, I want to make things that look like Nike. You should want to make things that look like you, and Nike should want to work with that because there is an audience for everything. You know, if you can find the right group that's into your stuff, a brand will find that attractive. So I was going with these cool looks because there was an artist whose work I was looking over a while ago that really inspired me, where they pumped a lot of cyan into highlights and it made this look very like surreal, like isolated urban city that almost doesn't exist. And I really wanted to play around with that style. So that's where the kind of this look was born from. I have another preset that I've created in the past that is more on the creative side instead of editorial. So a big thing that brands are tapping into right now is kind of a sense of nostalgia. Now that all the 90s kids are growing up, they're kind of going back to the 90s style to make people connect a little more personally with the stuff that they're doing. So I have this preset that I've created called Polaroid, and this is all in Lightroom, and it has a very Polaroid. It even has the borders involved, a ton of grain on it. And I think this really fits that nostalgic style. And once again, I'm not copying Nike's nostalgic style. I'm creating my own interpretation of a nostalgic style that someone like Nike might be interested in. So with this one, I can break it down really quickly. Our exposure settings were already dialed in for this shot. And where the look is really coming from is a lot of HSL things. So if I turn this off, this is pretty, what it looked like before. And then when I turn the hue on, suddenly you get a lot of faded colors that has that old vintage look. So we've moved hues in all sorts of different directions. We've cooled the reds, warmed the greens, cooled the magentas, brought down the saturation of almost every single color considerably, except for those skin tones, which we want to preserve to make it look realistic. And then the luminance, we're balancing out, picking a bunch of stuff up on the warm side, and then bringing a bunch of cooler things down to increase that contrast between our subject and our background. We've got some color grading going on between, once again, blue and yellow in shadows and highlights. And then with the effects panel, I've put a ton of grain on it. And I love grain. The more, the better, in my opinion. And when figuring out the balance between these three elements of the grain sliders in Lightroom, the way that I've found best works is literally a stair-step pattern. So it's like amount, then more size, then more roughness than that. And that's how I'll do it. So if I decrease the grain, I'll just bring these back to keep that stair-step pattern.
That's a good tip.
And then for the border, which I think is really unique because Lightroom doesn't really have a lot of options for compositing, this like Polaroid border is actually made from the vignetting tool. So if I turn this off, it's gone entirely. And if I reset this, it's gone as well. So to do this, I'm going to reset all these sliders. So you have no vignette. I do a vignette all the way to white. I'll take the midpoint as far back as I can. I will do the roundness to a minimum, so it's square. Actually, the midpoint I have inverted. So once I bring this roundness to square, it has that kind of rounded square rectangular edge look. I'll bring the midpoint as far back as possible to bring that in. And then the feather I will take out entirely, and now it's a sharp edge feather. And now we've created a Polaroid border just from a vignette.
That's so awesome.
And you can manipulate this a little bit, so you can kind of bring the feather in to make it a little more softer edge. I like the hard edge personally, or you could just make it a black frame. Or like a level of gray in between, or change the opacity with that. But yeah, I thought that was a fun little trick that I really haven't seen a lot of people do in Lightroom.
And so easy too, because when I saw you kind of scroll through that fast yesterday, I was like, oh, wow, how did he do that? So very helpful.
One other like cool Lightroom trick that I do is in preset creation. Some of my presets aren't designed for like start to finish looks. Some of them are just add-ons. So with presets, when you create them, they're based off of the settings of the current photo you have selected, and you can choose any setting that you've applied to that image to create as a preset, including masking. So there are some presets that I've created that exist only of just masks. Like this one here, I have an effect called flares. And what it does is it add a flare on each side of the photo coming from the top corner. One's blue and one's pink, and it adds just a little bit of extra layering and depth to your image. So without it, it looks like that. And then with it, it just adds 2 masks into it. So if I open the masks panel here, you can see mask 2 and mask 1. And this mask is just a cool down of temperature and tint, and then a decrease of highlights and a dehaze effect. So if I turn that one off and on, you'll see this little blue tint coming in from the side.
Yeah.
And then same with the other one, it's the same deal, but it's magenta and a little brightness. So now we have a Polaroid effect with flares added on top. And this was added creating 2 different presets.
So awesome. I love it. Very simple, very easy, and gives a big impact.
So I can apply this setting from this photo to some of these other shots we have just to cap things off. So some of these more casual looks where we're not really like active or exercising, but just kind of capturing candid moments of our athlete here, which I think helps in a well-balanced campaign. You know, it's not always just going to be your hero shots. Sometimes you need some supporting images to help it, you know, feel more cohesive. So I'm switching these to make the darker one kind of coming from the side more. And then this is kind of being motivated by the light source of the sun. So now we have, in 2 seconds, copy and paste those presets over. Another shot that kind of makes these look a lot more cohesive in theme. You could kind of bunch these together into a campaign. I can even do the same for a shot like this. And like this.
I really love that look.
A little bit of adjustments. I don't want to make our subject pop. And there's a lot of grain. It kind of looks like almost out of focus and blurry, but those elements help the nostalgia factor. When you're trying to tap into a certain style, you have to think of the real world application of it. So back in the day when people were using Polaroid cameras or Kodak cameras, you know, all that stuff was manually focused. People always missed focus. So having a blurry shot actually makes it look more true to the time, because there's more common of a look back then for things to be out of focus. It was hard to get shots that are in focus. I find that now when people say things look digital, they look really perfect because the tools are so powerful now that it's hard to take a bad picture.
Yeah, that's so true. We've been shooting more film lately to kind of study this look a little more, and it's really interesting to see.
And stuff like that helps too. If you can get your hands on the real world hardware from the time and study it, it'll help you kind of replicate those things with other equipment or other processes.
Absolutely.
A cool thing, one more thing. A cool thing about this whole border thing with the vignette tool is the vignette works off of your crop in Lightroom. So I can crop this to any aspect ratio and it'll still preserve. If I did a 1:1 square, you will still keep this border. and it'll just snap to whatever aspect ratio you're working with.
Yeah, that's so great.
And then adjusting the roundness also helps with some cool looks if you wanted more of like a rounded edge, or if you wanted to keep it all the way to the edge of the frame. So playing with these sliders will help give you some more unique looks with this fun little Lightroom trick.
I love that. Those look so good. Awesome. Well, I just want to see if anyone in the chat has any last minute questions for Daniel as we wrap up here. Thank you all for joining us today. It was so much fun. And Daniel, thank you so much for everything that you taught us today. I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did as well. Don't forget that you can go back and watch the replay of this stream as well as yesterday's stream. And be sure to stick around for our special pick of the Past Illustrator Daily Creative Challenge, immediately followed by day 2 of logo design with Thomas J. Stevens. Thank you so much, Daniel. It was great working with you today, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. Take care, everyone.
Take care.